Welcome to our midweek check-in. Today I want to talk about defiant joy. The question I've been pondering is, how do you live joyfully when life is hard or uncertain, as it is for many of us at the moment? I was brought up being taught that joy is not the same as happiness, that happiness is dependent on your circumstances, but joy isn't. But it begs the question, if joy isn't dependent on circumstances, what is it dependent on? This week at church we're going to begin a new series based on the book of Philippians, which is sometimes called the letter of joy. It grabbed my attention as I've been pondering where to go next, because it's written by the Apostle Paul from prison. As I mentioned last week in church, I've really been inspired by the survival stories of different people. Nelson Mandela, for example, is one of my heroes as I look at 25 years in prison and the way he came out not embittered but as a reconciler in his nation. And I've been thinking about him quite a bit this last week, remembering his physical discipline and his mental and spiritual discipline over all those years and thinking, how did he sustain that? Well, the Apostle Paul had a similar journey, and he begins in chapter 1 of his letter by saying to the Philippians, I thank God every time I remember you, and I pray for you with joy. If we were to flip back to Acts chapter 16, we'd see that Paul's introduction to the Philippians was in jail. He got arrested for preaching the gospel, got beaten up with his friend Silas, and then as they were released from jail, he refused to leave the town until he got a formal apology. And so as he writes now from prison in Rome and ultimately heading towards execution, my question is, how is he able to be thankful and joyful? He's not simply in lockdown. He has a Roman soldier on each wrist, a chain to him. It doesn't get much more invasive and restrictive than that. As I reflect on my own life and personality, I don't like restrictions. I don't like being told what I can or can't do. I remember as a kid, my brother and I were very strictly cautioned by our father not to go lighting what were then called penny bungers, which were quite big firecrackers which made a big exploding sound. And we were asked if we had any, and very dutifully both of us said no. Well, of course, that wasn't the truth. And at the back of our house, we had a big open bush area with some long grass, and we snuck out there one day and lit off a couple of those, not realising that in doing so, we were going to start a grass fire. Well, then the jig was up. We had to confess to our dad, and thankfully no major harm happened. But as I've got older, there are still times and places where I arc up when I face restriction. And I know many of us are just over the restrictions that are upon us at the moment. Even if we understand and appreciate the reasoning for them, it becomes wearying. It's hard in lockdown if you're trying to work from home, whether you're isolated, can't see family or friends, trying to homeschool. Whatever it is, it gets you down. Some people get depressed, some people get angry, and some people just stop complying because they've had enough. What are the options? The theme that I've chosen for today's brief message is defiant joy. And I've been deliberate in the choice of those words. They're not new words to me. They are words that took on quite significant meaning some years ago when my first wife had cancer. And life was tough. Life was challenging. And it didn't get better. In fact, ultimately, she lost her battle. But in the midst of that journey, we chose to take moments of defiant joy. And I want to define or explain defiant joy in this way. It's not about denying the circumstances or reality that we find ourselves in, but it's refusing to be defined by it. One of the challenges of any restriction or closing in of our life is that we become so focused on it we can't see anything else. Paul could easily have been like that in prison. He could have just focused on the fact that he was restricted, potentially awaiting execution, which was his fate, and feeling like his life and influence were over. But instead, he connects with his young mentoree, Timothy, and so the letter begins, Paul and Timothy. And he sends a message of hope to his friends in Philippi. And I have to say, as I've confronted restrictions at the moment, I've looked for ways of expressing defiant joy. Little moments to celebrate life. Some of you know I love to take photos and to post them, sunsets and sunrises particularly. That beginning and end of the day is a moment of defiant joy for me. Connecting over Zoom or similar with friends in our own country or in other parts of the world, and praying with those who are going through tough times. We've got a couple of friends at the moment who have just received cancer diagnoses or updated diagnoses and going for treatment. It's tough doing that in the midst of COVID, and so connecting with them and praying for them. Being thankful for them as Paul was, celebrating their lives and praying hopefully for them in the midst of this. And so my closing question for you this week, as I put it to myself, is what is one way in which you can express defiant joy? Refuse to be defined by the difficulties or restrictions that you face. Find something or someone to celebrate, to be thankful for. Not pretending that all the hardship's gone away, but remembering it doesn't have to have the final word or define you. More next week as we look at what is the source of defiant joy. Have a great week.